My father gave the family business to my brother and kicked me out. Dad gathered us in his lavish office. Walls covered with framed photos of Bishop Construction skyscrapers. One of them showed my first project, but the nameplate credited Jason. That should have been my first clue that today wasn't going to end well for me. The family business, Bishop Construction, had been my entire life. While other kids played video games, I was sketching building designs and learning about structural engineering. I wasn't just passionate, I was good at it. Really good. I graduated top of my class from MIT with innovative ideas about sustainable construction that could revolutionize the industry. For 3 years, I've been developing an integrated system for energy-efficient buildings that could cut costs by 30% while reducing environmental impact. The technology wasn't just green, it made financial sense too. At least, that's what I thought until today's investor meeting. I'd prepared for weeks. The presentation was polished, the numbers solid. As I walked through projections, I could see genuine interest from potential investors. Then Jason, my older brother and Dad's golden boy, cleared his throat. "While my brother's ideas are creative," he said with that condescending smile, "they're ultimately too risky and not profitable enough for Bishop Construction's portfolio." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jason went on to present his alternative, a luxury condo development using traditional methods. No innovation, no sustainability features. Just the same old blueprint we've been following for decades. I looked to Dad, waiting for him to back me up. After all, he'd always encouraged innovation in private conversations. But Dad nodded along with Jason, his face showing approval. Jason's approach is time-tested. Dad told the investors, "We know the margins, we know the timeline. It's the Bishop Construction way." The Bishop Construction way. The phrase echoed in my head as the investors nodded thoughtfully. 3 years of my research and development dismissed in 5 minutes. After the meeting, I cornered Dad in his office. "You didn't even give my ideas a chance," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mike, this isn't college," he replied, not even looking up from his desk. "This is business. Real business. Jason understands that. Jason understands outdated thinking that's killing this planet." I shot back. Dad finally looked up, his expression hardening. "That attitude is exactly why today's announcement is probably going to disappoint you." I knew what he was talking about. Today was the big succession ceremony, where Dad would officially announce how ownership of Bishop Construction would transfer to the next generation. The entire company would be there. 4 hours later, I stood in the grand ballroom of the Marriott downtown, nursing a sparkling water and trying to look optimistic. Employees and business partners mingled around, everyone waiting for Dad's big announcement. Mom kept shooting me sympathetic glances from across the room, which only made me more nervous. When Dad took the stage, the room fell silent. He gave his usual speech about building the company from nothing, about his vision and perseverance. Then came the moment of truth. Bishop Construction has always been about family, but also about making smart business decisions, he said, glancing between Jason and me. "After careful consideration, I've decided on the following ownership structure. Jason will receive 55% of the company's shares and the position of CEO. The room burst into applause while I stood frozen, my glass halfway to my lips. More than half the company? I knew Jason would get more, but this gave him complete control. I'll be retaining 30% ownership and will continue as chairman of the board. Dad continued after the applause died down. The remaining 5% will stay with our current minority shareholders. I noticed he hadn't mentioned me at all, not even a token share. The 10% I own were shares I'd purchased myself years ago, back when the company was still struggling and needed capital. I'd invested every penny of my savings because I believed in what we were building. Now, after all my years of education and innovation, I wasn't deemed worthy of a single additional share. The room was spinning slightly, and I set my untouched drink down on a nearby table. Dad found me later as I was standing alone by the refreshment table. "Your green ideas won't bring profits in the real world," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Be grateful for what you got." Grateful, right, for being publicly humiliated and having my life's work dismissed. The evening dragged on. with executives congratulating Jason and giving me awkward pats on the back. I needed air and headed out to the hotel's garden terrace, finding a quiet corner behind some ornamental shrubs. That's when I heard Jason's voice from the other side of the greenery. He was talking to Roland Weber, one of our biggest investors. The East Side development? Yeah, that's happening immediately, Jason was saying. We're converting all of it into a shopping complex. Breaking ground next month. My blood froze. The East Side development was my pet project. 15 acres I'd been planning to transform into a mixed-use eco-community with a public park at its center. Dad had promised me I could lead that project, regardless of the succession outcome. What about the environmental concerns? Weber asked. Wasn't there some issue with protected wetlands? Jason laughed. Nothing that can't be handled with the right permits and the right donations to the right campaigns. The profit margins on this will be insane once we maximize the retail space. I stepped back, my mind racing. This wasn't just about pushing me aside anymore. Jason was planning to bulldoze everything I'd worked for and replace it with another soulless shopping mall. And he was willing to skirt environmental regulations to do it. As I listened to them discuss how they'd handle the environmental impact studies, something shifted inside me. The hurt and disappointment crystallized into something harder, sharper. I'd spent my life playing by the rules, trusting the system, believing that good ideas would eventually win out. Maybe it was time to try something different. I slipped away before they could notice me, already formulating a plan. Dad and Jason thought my ideas weren't profitable in the real world. Fine. I'd show them exactly what my innovations could do and what the company was losing by pushing me aside. The week after the company succession announcement felt like walking through quicksand. Each day at the office became more uncomfortable as colleagues gave me those pitying glances in the hallway. I kept my head down, avoided Jason and Dad, and focused on developing some kind of plan to leverage my 10% ownership stake. That's when Mom called with the news that changed everything. Uncle Harry was gone, found alone in his remote desert home, passed away in his sleep. I hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years, a realization that hit me with unexpected guilt. 3 days later, I stood among a small gathering of mourners in a modest funeral home in Alpine, Texas. Just immediate family and a handful of former colleagues from his mining days made the effort to attend. As the minister spoke words that barely captured who Uncle Harry really was, my mind drifted back to when I was 12. Uncle Harry had been the only one who didn't laugh at my rock collection. While Dad dismissed it as playing with dirt, Uncle Harry had presented me with my first real geological hammer, eyes twinkling as he told me, "There's a future in these rocks, Mike." Everyone else just saw a pile of worthless stones. Dad stood stiffly in his dark suit, checking his watch and smartphone whenever he thought no one was looking. Jason hadn't even bothered to show up, claiming an unmovable investor meeting that somehow took priority over family. Uncle Harry Bishop had always been the family oddball, Dad's younger brother, who chose studying Earth over building on top of it. A brilliant geologist at BHP Billiton, until management fired him 8 years ago. The family whispers painted him as stubborn and impractical, insisting on exploring what the company labeled a worthless claim despite direct orders to abandon it. After his termination, he liquidated his retirement funds and disappeared to a remote property in the desert. The family effectively wrote him off as a failure, someone who couldn't function in the real world. At holiday dinners, Mom would occasionally mention him with that particular tone reserved for relatives who made embarrassing life choices. But to 12-year-old me, Uncle Harry showed me a different world. The summer before 7th grade, I spent 2 weeks with him in his desert home. While Dad was busy expanding his real estate empire, Uncle Harry introduced me to the ancient history beneath our feet. We'd wake before sunrise to hike through canyons, Uncle Harry pointing out different formations and explaining how each layer represented millions of years of Earth story. "See this line right here?" he'd say, running his weathered hand across striped sedimentary rock. "That's not just dirt. That's a chapter in history. You just need to learn how to read it." One scorching afternoon, we ventured deeper into his property than ever before. The landscape appeared harsh and unwelcoming to most, all rust-colored earth and sparse vegetation that somehow thrived despite impossible conditions. People look at land like this and see nothing valuable. Uncle Harry told me as we climbed a particularly steep ridge. Empty wasteland. That's because they're looking with the wrong eyes. When we reached the summit, he pulled out water bottles from his backpack and handed one to me. The future isn't in fancy buildings, Mike. It's in understanding what lies beneath our feet, the elements that will power what comes next. I didn't fully grasp his meaning then. I was just a kid fascinated by dinosaur fossils and sparkly minerals. Yet something about his conviction stayed with me, eventually influencing my interest in sustainable building materials and green technology. After the service concluded, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses approached our family. Mr. Abernathy. He introduced himself with a solemn nod. Your brother's attorney. If the family could meet at my office tomorrow morning, there are some matters regarding Harry's estate that require attention. Dad barely concealed his dismissive attitude. Can't be much to divide, he muttered under his breath, but agreed to the meeting. The next morning, our remaining family, Dad, Mom, my sister Claire, and myself, gathered in Abernathy's modest office. The small room quickly filled with the scent of Dad's expensive cologne mixing unpleasantly with the musty odor of old legal books. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat and began reading the will. The house and its contents went to Claire, who seemed genuinely surprised but pleased. She had always admired Uncle Harry's independent spirit, even without sharing his geological passions. A small savings account was divided among local conservation organizations. Then Abernathy turned to me. To my nephew Michael Bishop, who alone saw value where others saw nothing, I leave my 50 acres of land in Brewster County, all mineral rights included, along with my research materials and geological equipment. May you discover what I always knew was there. The room fell silent. Dad shifted impatiently. 50 acres of empty desert, he remarked with a dismissive wave. Wonderful inheritance. But I couldn't speak. Memories flooded back. That ridge, those conversations about hidden potential, the future concealed in ordinary rock. This wasn't a random bequest. Uncle Harry had chosen me specifically because of the connection we'd formed during those exploration weeks. There's one more item, Abernathy added, pulling a sealed envelope from the file. Harry left this letter for Mike, to be opened privately. The drive back to what was now Claire's property was tense. Dad spent most of it on conference calls, barking instructions about cost overruns on a development in Phoenix. Apparently, Jason's first major project as CEO was already running into serious trouble. $3 million over budget already. Dad growled after hanging up. This Arizona project is becoming a complete disaster. Mom patted his arm reassuringly. I'm sure Jason will work it out, dear. He just needs more time. I gazed out the window at the passing landscape, feeling the weight of Uncle Harry's letter in my pocket. The desert looked entirely different now. Part of it belonged to me. When we arrived, Claire began inventorying her inheritance while Mom complained about the dust. Dad announced he needed to return to the city by morning. The company crisis demanded his attention. You should sell that land, Mike, he suggested as we brought in luggage. The company's facing serious cash flow issues with this Phoenix situation. Could use the liquidity, and though that property isn't worth much, every bit helps right now. I just inherited it today, Dad. I replied, maybe I should at least see what I actually own first. He shrugged indifferently. Suit yourself. But the company's in a tight spot. Jason made some aggressive financial decisions. Your brother could use some family support. The irony of him asking me to bail out Jason after being completely overlooked at the succession ceremony was almost laughable. That night, after everyone retired to bed, I finally opened Uncle Harry's letter. Inside was a single page of his distinctive handwriting and a small key. Mike, it read, if you're reading this, I ran out of time. The answers are in my workshop, in the lockbox under the Geological Survey maps. The corporation was wrong. I was right. There's a fortune under those rocks, but not the kind they were looking for. Check my journals, especially the entries from 2015. Look for formation I called the Dragon's Back. And whatever you do, don't sell the land. Not before you understand what you have. What we have. It's not just rocks, Mike. It's the future. I slipped quietly to Uncle Harry's workshop behind the main house. The simple structure served as half storage shed, half laboratory. A fine layer of dust covered everything, undisturbed since his passing. His geological equipment remained meticulously organized on shelves, specialized hammers, sieves, magnifiers, and testing kits. Against one wall stood filing cabinets labeled by region and year. The survey maps covered a large table in the center. Lifting them carefully, I found the lockbox, small and constructed of fireproof metal. The key fit perfectly. Inside were several notebooks, Uncle Harry's field journals, and a USB drive. But what immediately caught my attention were the rock samples, carefully labeled and arranged in section containers. Each bore coordinates that I assumed corresponded to locations on my newly inherited land. I grabbed the journal marked 2015 and began reading. Uncle Harry's excitement jumped off the pages, his handwriting growing increasingly urgent as the entries progressed. Confirmed today what I suspected, one entry read, "The concentration is among the highest recorded. They're all looking for oil and gas. Fools. The real value isn't in fossil fuels. It's in what's needed for the next energy revolution." The final entry, dated just 3 weeks before his death, sent chills down my spine. Received the final assay results. Even better than expected. If my calculations are correct, this deposit could be worth billions in the coming market. Have to be careful now. Others would kill for this information. Beneath the journals was a folder containing detailed geological surveys, chemical analyses, and market projections. And at the very bottom of the box lay a map with an X marking an area labeled Dragon's Back, and the words, "Main Deposit," underlined 3 times. I stayed awake all night, studying Uncle Harry's research, the pieces gradually connecting. By dawn, I understood why he'd been so adamant about that worthless claim, why he'd spent his life savings buying those specific 50 acres, and why he'd left it all to me. Uncle Harry hadn't been a failure who couldn't follow rules. He'd been a visionary who recognized value that everyone else missed, and now that vision was mine to carry forward, if I was brave enough to follow the path he'd mapped. As the sun rose over the desert, I made my decision. I wouldn't be selling those 50 acres to help rescue Jason's failed project. Not now. Not ever. I returned to Dallas with a new sense of purpose. While Dad and Jason flew back immediately to handle the Phoenix Project disaster, I took the scenic route, my head filled with Uncle Harry's discoveries. The USB drive contained years of research, geological surveys, chemical analyses, and market projections that confirmed what his journal suggested. The land contained a significant deposit of rare earth minerals, essential for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles and renewable energy technology. The quarterly shareholder meeting was scheduled for the following week. As a 10% stakeholder, I had every right to attend, though in the past I'd always been there as dad's son and company engineer, not as an independent shareholder challenging the leadership. The irony wasn't lost on me. The corporate headquarters lobby felt different this time. Security guards who normally greeted me with friendly nods now checked my ID carefully. The receptionist who used to bring me coffee, without asking, called up to confirm my appointment. Word travels fast when you're on the outs with a family that signs the paychecks. Dad and Jason were already in the boardroom when I arrived. The tension was palpable as shareholders and board members filtered in, sensing the family drama beneath the surface. 10 minutes into Jason's presentation about exciting new directions for Bishop Construction, Dad interrupted to address what he called pressing family business. "Before we continue," he announced, looking directly at me, "I need to address a concerning situation. My son Michael has been offered a fair price for an inherited property important to our Phoenix development. Despite the company's current financial challenges, he's refused to sell, prioritizing his personal interests over the success of Bishop Construction." The room went silent. This was a calculated move, Dad making my private inheritance a public matter. "The land in question is worthless desert scrub that my brother inexplicably left to Michael," Dad continued. "We've offered market value, but apparently family loyalty means nothing compared to some sentimental attachment to dust and rocks." I stood up, determined to maintain my composure. The land was left to me personally, not Bishop Construction. It's not part of company assets, and never was. And contrary to what's been suggested, I've conducted preliminary surveys indicating the property has significant value, just not for shopping malls. Dad's face reddened. Are you following Harry's foolish obsession now? He was fired for chasing mineral fantasies instead of doing his actual job. Maybe the company that fired him should have listened, I replied, clutching a folder containing Uncle Harry's most conclusive test results. I brought copies of geological surveys that... Jason cut me off. This isn't a science fair, Mike. It's business. Either you're with this company or you're against it. I looked around the room at the uncomfortable faces of board members and shareholders. These people had known me my entire life. Some had watched me grow up. None would meet my eyes now. I think we need to clarify your position with the company, Dad said coldly. Given your unwillingness to support our current direction, I suggest a leave of absence until you reconsider your priorities. It wasn't a suggestion. By the end of the day, my key card stopped working. HR sent an email about transitioning company assets, including the downtown apartment that had been my home for the past 5 years. My company credit cards were deactivated while I was trying to buy lunch. The swift, calculated nature of it all showed this had been planned well before the meeting. That evening, Claire called. They can't just throw you out, she said, her voice a mix of anger and concern. Technically, they can, I replied, packing what I could into my SUV. The apartment's a company asset. Dad's name is on the lease, not mine. Stay with me, she offered, at least until you figure things out. I appreciated the offer, but my sister's place was a small one-bedroom in the Arts District. Besides, I already knew what I needed to do next. Thanks, but I've made a decision. I'm going to develop Uncle Harry's land myself. Her silence spoke volumes. You think I'm crazy, too? I said. No, she finally answered. I think you're braver than I'd be. But, Mike, they won't stop at taking your apartment. Jason's already talking to people. Construction firms, engineering outfits. They're all getting the message that hiring Michael Bishop would be a bad business move. She wasn't wrong. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 promising job interviews mysteriously ended with we decided to go in another direction. Former colleagues stopped returning my calls. My professional network, built over years in the Dallas construction scene, suddenly developed collective amnesia about my existence. With my savings dwindling and no job prospects, I made the decision. I sold my furniture, put the rest in storage, and purchased a used trailer with what remained. If I couldn't work in construction in Dallas, I'd build something of my own on Uncle Harry's land, my land. The drive to West Texas was long and lonely. The farther I got from Dallas, the more the landscape changed, buildings and highways giving way to vast open spaces. By the time I reached Brewster County, it felt like I'd entered another world entirely. The nearest town was Alpine, a small community that seemed frozen in time compared to the constant evolution of Dallas's skyline. Getting the trailer onto my property proved more challenging than expected. The dirt access road hadn't been maintained in years, and recent rains had created ruts deep enough to swallow a tire. After nearly getting stuck twice, I managed to position the trailer on a relatively flat area near where Uncle Harry had marked potential water sources in his notes. That first night was a harsh reality check. The September desert dropped to near freezing once the sun set. The trailer's heating system produced more noise and warmth. The generator sputtered and died around midnight, plunging me into darkness. I spent the rest of the night huddled under every blanket I owned, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Morning came with unexpected noise. Someone was outside. I stumbled out to find an older man with weathered skin and a military-straight posture examining my pathetic setup. Generators flooded, he announced without introduction. And you parked in a washout zone. First good rain, you'll be floating halfway to Mexico. Who are you? I asked, still half asleep. Jack Ellison. Got the property next over. He gestured vaguely eastward. Harry's sister called. Said his nephew might be fool enough to try living out here, without knowing what he's doing. Looks like she was right. Over the next few hours, Jack helped me move the trailer to higher ground and got the generator running properly. As we worked, he shared that he'd been a combat engineer in Vietnam, then worked oil rigs across Texas before retiring to get away from people's nonsense. He'd been neighbors with Uncle Harry for almost a decade. That night, a fierce windstorm hit the area. My trailer shook so violently I genuinely thought it might roll over. Jack, who'd stayed to make sure everything was secured properly, just laughed at my wide-eyed panic. "City boy, you haven't seen a real storm yet," he said, calmly sipping coffee as the wind howled outside. "This is just the desert saying hello." The next 2 weeks became my crash course in desert survival, with Jack as my reluctant instructor. He showed me how to properly anchor the trailer, set up rain catchment systems, and identify which local plants were useful. We established a rudimentary solar setup, supplemented by the generator for cloudy days. Each lesson came with gruff commentary about soft city folk, and how Uncle Harry had at least bothered to learn before he settled in. Then came the dust storm. The sky turned an eerie orange-brown as visibility dropped to almost nothing. Jack had warned me about securing everything, but I hadn't taken it seriously enough. When the storm hit full force, I was still scrambling to tie down equipment. Through the swirling dust, I noticed a roof panel flying off from a small house about a quarter-mile away. Without thinking, I grabbed some tools and made my way toward it, using my truck as a windbreak. The home belonged to an elderly woman named Eliza Collins, a retired schoolteacher who'd taught in Alpine for 40 years. Together, we managed to secure a tarp over the damaged section before the storm could cause more destruction. "Harry's nephew, aren't you?" she asked afterward, serving me tea in a kitchen filled with photographs of generations of students. "He always said you were the sharp one." The following Sunday, Mrs. Collins insisted I accompany her to the small community church in town. After the service, the pastor introduced me to the congregation as Harry Bishop's nephew who's taking up his place. People who had eyed me suspiciously in the local hardware store days earlier now offered handshakes and invitations to dinner. It seemed Uncle Harry had been more respected in this community than in our own family. With Jack's help and equipment, I decided it was time to address my most pressing problem, water. Uncle Harry's notes indicated several potential well sites, with one marked as most promising near the area he called Dragon's Back, a ridge whose profile resembled a sleeping dragon when viewed from a right angle. The drilling was tedious work. Jack operated the small rig he brought over, while I monitored the soil and rock samples coming up. 3 days of effort yielded nothing but frustration and increasing depth. Maybe Harry's notes were off, Jack suggested as we approached the 15-foot mark. Wouldn't be the first time someone misjudged where water hides around here. I was about to agree when the drill bit suddenly jerked and slowed. "Hit something," Jack announced, reversing the drill slightly. When we pulled it up, the bit was coated with fragments of unusual dark rock streaked with colorful veins, blue, purple, and green running through the black matrix. "That's not normal for this region," Jack said, examining the fragments with unexpected interest. "Usually get sandstone and limestone. This looks almost like—" He didn't finish his sentence, just kept turning the pieces in his hand. The next morning, 3 pickup trucks I didn't recognize drove slowly past my property. That afternoon, a man in an expensive-looking SUV with Arizona plates stopped by, claiming he was just checking out the area for hunting opportunities, despite it being nowhere near hunting season. He asked surprisingly specific questions about how much land I owned and whether I considered selling. By week's end, I'd received 2 unsolicited offers for my worthless desert property, one from a Phoenix development company I'd never heard of, and another from a mineral speculation outfit based in Nevada. Both offer amounts that would have seemed generous a month ago, but were insultingly low compared to what Uncle Harry's research suggested the land might be worth. The timing seemed far too coincidental. When I mentioned it to Mrs. Collins during a visit to fix her porch step, she let something slip. "Oh, Jack was showing those interesting rocks you found at the general store yesterday. Quite a crowd gathered to look at them. He was quite proud to have helped you find something unusual." So that explained it. Jack had inadvertently spread the word about our discovery. I didn't blame him. He couldn't have known the potential value of what we'd found. But it meant my secret was out, at least locally. And in small towns, secrets have a way of traveling fast and far. Something had changed. Someone had noticed what we'd pulled from that test well, and word was spreading faster than desert wildfire. I carefully placed the strange rock samples in Uncle Harry's old safe that night, along with his research materials. Whatever we'd found, it was clear I wasn't the only one interested anymore. The increased attention to my property meant I needed answers fast. What exactly had we found in that well? Uncle Harry's journals mentioned rare earth elements, but I needed current expert analysis to be sure. Jack suggested I talk to Mrs. Collins. Apparently her daughter was back in town and might be able to help. Sarah's got some fancy geology degree from back east. He explained while helping me reinforce my trailer's foundation. Smart as they come. Been working for some big mining outfit until her mom took that fall last spring. The next day, I drove to Mrs. Collins' house with my samples carefully packed in a tackle box. The woman who answered the door looked nothing like what I'd expected. Sarah Collins was around my age, with practical short hair and the confident stance of someone used to working in the field. She listened carefully as I explained my situation, examining the rock samples with naked curiosity. "I can run some basic tests here," she said, gesturing toward what had once been a dining room, but now housed an impressive collection of scientific equipment. But for anything definitive, we'd need a specialized lab. Sarah's makeshift lab was a testament to her dedication to her field. Despite being stuck in small-town Texas caring for her mother, she maintained her connection to scientific research, cobbling together equipment that would have impressed my engineering professors. Over the next few days, Sarah ran preliminary tests on the samples. We spent hours discussing Uncle Harry's research and comparing it with her findings. Her expertise in geology complemented my engineering background perfectly. For the first time since leaving Dallas, I felt energized, purposeful, like I was building something meaningful instead of just surviving. A week later, Sarah called and asked me to come over immediately. She had that tone people get when they're trying to contain excitement. When I arrived, she was hunched over a microscope, her entire dining room turned lab covered in papers, testing materials and rock samples. Sarah placed one of my samples under the microscope and stepped aside for me to look. I saw colorful crystalline structures, beautiful but meaningless to my untrained eye. She explained what I was seeing, her words coming faster as her excitement grew. According to her analysis, the samples contained significant deposits of neodymium, dysprosium, and other rare earth elements crucial for manufacturing everything from smartphones to electric vehicles and wind turbines. But what made her particularly excited was the quality and concentration. Sarah placed another sample under the microscope and gestured for me to look again. "This neodymium is the same quality as what they import from China at ridiculous prices," she explained, barely containing her enthusiasm. "What your uncle found here is like discovering oil in the 1920s. Her words hung in the air between us. If she was right, and her credentials suggested she was, Uncle Harry hadn't been chasing fantasies. He discovered a domestic source of materials that currently came almost exclusively from foreign suppliers, often at the mercy of international politics and trade restrictions. "We need to confirm this with more specialized equipment," Sarah cautioned, though her excitement remained evident. "I have contacted my old lab who might help discreetly." 2 weeks later, the comprehensive lab results confirmed Sarah's initial findings. My inheritance wasn't just valuable. It was potentially transformative, both for me personally and possibly for domestic technology manufacturing. The land contained one of the largest deposits of high-grade rare earth elements ever discovered in North America. The day after we received confirmation, a sleek black SUV pulled up to my trailer. A man in an expensive suit that looked ridiculously out of place in the desert heat introduced himself as Robert Westfield from Western Resources, a mining corporation with operations throughout the Southwest. "We've heard there might be some interesting mineral formations on this property," he said smoothly, handing me a business card embossed with gold lettering. "Our company would like to make you a generous offer." The generous offer was $2.3 million, about 40 times what the land would be worth for conventional development or ranching. To someone who'd been living in a trailer and stretching every dollar, it was life-changing money. It was also, according to Sarah, laughably inadequate given what we now knew. "They're lowballing you by a factor of at least 20, she said when I showed her the offer letter. "They know exactly what's here. Someone tipped them off. The pointed look she gave me made it clear she suspected Jack's loose talk at the general store had reached more important ears than just local gossips. Western Resources called every day for a week, gradually increasing their offer to $3.5 million. Each time, Westfield emphasized that they had the expertise and equipment to develop the land properly, unlike a lone individual with limited resources. He wasn't wrong about the resources part. Developing a mining operation would require millions in startup capital, specialized equipment, permits, and skilled personnel. Money I definitely didn't have. "We should partner up," Sarah suggested one evening as we pored over geological maps spread across my tiny trailer table. "Form our own company. Keep control of the operation rather than selling out." "With what money?" I asked, gesturing around at my humble living situation. Banks aren't exactly lining up to loan millions to an unemployed engineer living in a trailer. Sarah's solution was unexpected but brilliant. Her doctoral advisor at MIT, Professor Leon, had connections throughout the tech industry, including venture capitalists in Silicon Valley who invested in resource development related to technology manufacturing. If we could get a meeting, we might find investors interested in a domestic rare earth element source. Professor Leon came through with an invitation to present at a technology resources conference in Austin the following month. We spent weeks preparing, combining Sarah's geological expertise with my engineering background to create a compelling presentation on American-sourced critical materials for next-generation technology. The conference was intimidating. A sea of industry experts, tech investors, and established resource companies with decades of experience and billions in assets. Sarah and I, in our carefully selected but obviously non-designer business attire, stood out as amateurs, yet our presentation generated more interest than we dared hope. Our angle was uniquely appealing in the current economic and political climate. Domestic rare earth elements meant reduced dependence on foreign suppliers, more stable supply chains, and fewer international complications. Several investors approached us afterward, and by evening's end, we had 3 serious inquiries about potential partnerships. The most promising came from Green Tech Ventures, a firm specializing in environmentally responsible resource development. Their offer, $10 million in startup funding for a 30% stake in our company, was both generous and structured to leave us with control. More importantly, they had the industry connections and regulatory experience we desperately needed. 2 days after returning from Austin, flush with success in finalizing details with Green Tech as lawyers, I received an unexpected visitor. It wasn't Western Resources this time, but a familiar face I hadn't seen since Dallas. Jason's executive assistant, Lisa. "Your brother would like to meet," she said, looking uncomfortable delivering the message. Neutral ground. Just to talk. I agreed to meet Jason at a restaurant in Alpine, curious about the sudden desire for reconciliation. The Jason who walked in was a shadow of his former confident self. The Phoenix project disaster had apparently escalated, with cost overruns now exceeding $15 million and threatening Bishop Construction's financial stability. "Look, we got off on the wrong foot with this land thing," he said, uncharacteristically humble. "Dad's old school, you know how he gets, but we're still family." The conversation meandered through careful small talk until Jason finally reached his point. Bishop Construction needed capital. Fast. The banks were restricting their credit lines due to the Phoenix situation, and they had major payments coming due. "I heard you might have found something valuable out here," he admitted, "and that you're working with some investment group now." I was about to respond when a familiar face caught my eye. Robert Westfield from Western Resources was sitting at the bar, pretending not to watch our table. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. "Interesting timing, Jason," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building inside me. "You show up right when I'm finalizing a deal with investors, and coincidentally, your new friend from Western Resources happens to be at the same restaurant." Jason's expression shifted from fake sincerity to cold calculation in an instant. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. You're not here for reconciliation. You're here to gather intelligence for your new partners, trying to undercut my deal or pressure me into selling to them." I stood up, tossing my napkin on the table. "Tell Westfield over there that my answer is still no. And as for family helping family, You should have thought about that before you and Dad pushed me out. I walked out, feeling Jason's glare on my back. The casual family meeting had been nothing but a reconnaissance mission, and I'd nearly fallen for it. When I got back to my trailer, I called Sarah and asked her to do some digging into Western Resources' recent activities. The next morning, she arrived with printouts of news stories and financial filings. Western Resources had recently established a strategic partnership with several construction companies facing financial difficulties, offering cash infusions in exchange for help securing mineral rights in promising areas. One of their new partners, mentioned only in passing in an industry newsletter, was Bishop Construction. The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. Jason hadn't come because he wanted reconciliation. He'd partnered with Western Resources, offering to help them secure my land in exchange for financial support for a failing family company. My own brother was trying to undercut my negotiating position and help a corporate giant snatch my inheritance for a fraction of its worth. As I stared at the evidence spread across my trailer table, I realized this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about family betrayal, corporate greed, and the future of what could become a strategically important American resource. Whatever happened next, I couldn't let Jason and Western Resources win this battle. Too much was at stake, not just for me, but potentially for the entire domestic technology manufacturing sector. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of activity. With Green Tech Ventures backing, Sarah and I incorporated as Revival Resources, secured the necessary permits, and began preliminary development of our site. We hired the best environmental consultants to ensure our operation would have minimal impact on the surrounding desert ecosystem. Uncle Harry would have wanted it that way. Sarah developed an innovative processing method that significantly reduced the toxic byproducts typically associated with rare earth element extraction. My engineering background proved useful in designing efficient infrastructure for the remote location. We complemented each other perfectly, her geological expertise matching my practical building knowledge. Western Resources and Bishop Construction didn't give up easily. They challenged our permits, spread rumors about environmental dangers to the local community, and even tried to pressure Green Tech to withdraw their support. Their tactics only strengthened our resolve and brought the Alpine community closer to our side. When the county commissioners held a public hearing about our operation, over 200 locals showed up wearing homemade Revival Resources T-shirts that Mrs. Collins and her church group had created. Jack became our unofficial security director, recruiting several of his retired veteran buddies to keep an eye on the property during the development phase. Just in case someone gets any funny ideas about equipment accidents, he explained with a knowing look. His team of gray-haired former military men patrolling in pickup trucks became a familiar sight around our growing operation. Our first test extraction exceeded all expectations. The concentration and quality of the rare earth elements were even better than our initial samples had indicated. Tech manufacturers, eager for a stable domestic supply chain, began signing preliminary agreements before we'd even completed our processing facility. As our company grew, Sarah and I grew closer. What began as a professional partnership evolved into something deeper. One evening, after receiving particularly promising assay results, we celebrated with dinner on the ridge we'd come to call Dragon's Back. Under a spectacular desert sunset, surrounded by the land that changed both our lives, I asked her to marry me. Her yes echoed across the valley. We married in the small Alpine church 6 months later. The entire town turned out for the celebration. By then, we'd hired 37 local residents and were developing training programs for specialized positions. Our company was becoming integral to the community's future. Instead of building a typical corporate headquarters, we invested in the town itself. Revival Resources funded a new fire station, technology upgrades to the local school, and established a scholarship program for Alpine High graduates interested in geology or engineering. We wanted success that extended beyond our balance sheet. Meanwhile, Bishop Construction's troubles continued to mount. The Phoenix development became a legal nightmare as structural issues emerged in the hastily completed first phase. Multiple lawsuits followed, and their insurance refused to cover the damages, citing negligence. News outlets that once celebrated the company's success now ran stories about cutting corners and prioritizing profit over safety. I followed these developments from a distance, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. The company my grandfather had founded was collapsing under the weight of poor decisions and mismanagement. Through our industry connections, I heard that Western Resources had withdrawn their support after the first round of lawsuits, leaving Bishop Construction without their financial lifeline. Jason's gamble had backfired spectacularly. 3 years after that first windstorm nearly blew away my trailer, I stood on that same spot, now transformed. Where my humble home once stood, we were completing the final phase of our innovative rare earth processing center. The facility combined cutting-edge technology with sustainable practices, setting new standards for the industry. Revival Resources had grown to over 100 employees and was supplying critical materials to technology manufacturers across the country. That morning, I received an unexpected email from my mother. Dad had suffered a mild heart attack following Bishop Construction's bankruptcy filing. He was stable, but the experience had changed him. She asked if I would consider meeting with him and Jason. They wanted to talk. My first instinct was to ignore the request. These were the people who had pushed me out, attempted to undermine my business, and never once reached out during my struggle or success. But something made me hesitate before hitting delete. That evening, I found myself thumbing through Uncle Harry's journals again. A particular entry caught my attention, one I hadn't focused on before. It was dated just weeks before his death. Spent the day surveying the eastern edge of Dragon's Back. The readings confirmed what I suspected for years. But I'm starting to understand that the true value of this land isn't what's beneath it, but how it tests a person's character. Only by facing adversity do we learn the worth of genuine relationships and the emptiness of mere ambition. Those words resonated differently now that I'd experienced both sides of fortune. I decided to agree to the meeting. We met at a neutral location, a restaurant in Midland, halfway between Dallas and Alpine. Dad looked older, diminished somehow. The confident businessman who had intimidated boardrooms was gone, replaced by a man whose face showed every year of his life. Jason appeared equally transformed, the designer suits and arrogant posture abandoned for more modest attire and demeanor. Instead of the confrontation I'd expected, the meeting became a reckoning of sorts. Dad admitted that he'd been wrong about my green ideas and Uncle Harry's worthless land. The bankruptcy had forced him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about business and family. Jason, stripped of his executive title and comfortable lifestyle, acknowledged that he'd never actually earned his position. It had been handed to him along with a set of values that ultimately failed. They were there to ask for jobs, not executive positions or ownership stakes, but actual working roles where they could contribute based on genuine ability rather than family connection. Dad believed his experience in construction could help with our expanding infrastructure needs. Jason, humbled by failure, was willing to start wherever needed and work his way up legitimately. I thought about declining, about the satisfaction of watching them walk away empty-handed, as I once had. But Uncle Harry's words about the true test of character kept returning to me. I'll need to discuss this with Sarah and our board. I told them, we make decisions as a team now. The next week, after thorough discussion, we offered Dad a position as a construction consultant for our expanding processing facility. Jason received an entry-level position in our community relations department, a role that would require him to rebuild trust with people rather than exploit them. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. Dad's practical experience proved genuinely valuable as we scaled our operations. Free from the pressure of being the ultimate decision-maker, he actually enjoyed focusing purely on building things properly. He took pride in quality rather than just profit margins. Jason struggled initially, unaccustomed to earning respect rather than demanding it. But gradually, he developed authentic relationships with community members and discovered talents he never knew he had. His first successful initiative, a training program for local high school students interested in technology manufacturing, showed a side of him I'd never seen before. On the 3rd anniversary of Revival Resources' founding, we broke ground on the Harry Bishop Education Center, a facility dedicated to training specialists in sustainable resource extraction and processing. During the ceremony, I watched my father proudly showing his grandson, Sarah and my 6-month-old son, the architectural models of the buildings he had helped design. Later that evening, Sarah found me staring at a framed photo of Uncle Harry that hung in our headquarters lobby. "I have something to show you," she said, leading me to her office. She pulled up geological surveys completed the previous week. We've been mapping the deeper mineral deposits, and Mike, the formation extends much further than we initially thought. It could be the largest deposit in North America. I studied the maps, thinking about how Uncle Harry had been ridiculed 30 years ago for suggesting exactly what was now proven true. He'd seen the future when others could only see worthless desert. As Sarah and I walked out to our car, the desert sunset painted everything in gold. Our facility stood as a testament to perseverance and vision, creating not just profits, but a stronger community and family relationships I'd once thought permanently broken. Uncle Harry was right about the true value of this land. The rare earth elements beneath the surface had changed my life, but the journey itself had transformed me. From comfortable corporate engineer to desperate trailer dweller to successful company founder, each step had taught me something essential about what truly matters. In the end, the greatest inheritance wasn't the minerals worth billions, but the wisdom to understand that real wealth isn't measured by what you own, but by what you build, both in the physical world and in the relationships that give life its meaning.